What's causing delays at Arizona ports of entry?
Large numbers of people running through vehicle lanes, and again, there's a danger in that.
Arizona in play come 2020. A reporter roundtable offers insight.
We're going to see all kinds of records broken in terms of spending.
Plus, location is everything, say the scientists studying the asteroid Bennu.
The heart of the mission occurs in 5 seconds out of 14 years.
Hello and welcome to Arizona 360. I'm Lorraine Rivera. Thank you for joining us. Wait times at some Arizona ports of entry have jumped this holiday season. Customs and Border Protection says it's largely because of increased security measures. Guadalupe Ramirez, the Director of Field Operations for CBP in Arizona, joined me in studio to explain why the agency has reduced the number of lanes in Nogales.
Right before the Christmas shopping season, unfortunately, we had an influx of individuals that were running through our passenger vehicle lanes, disrupting our operations, so in large numbers. Unfortunately, that required that we realign our resources to address that threat. We basically had to harden the port. And by that, I mean we had to put security measures in place, and unfortunately, that meant restricting some of the lanes so that we could narrow their entry and we could put officers to prevent that entry.
Is this a new tactic? Because we have seen people actually line up and then wait to be processed or request asylum. You're talking about walking up to vehicle lanes.
Running through vehicle lanes. Large numbers of people running through vehicle lanes. And again, there's a danger in that, both for them and our officers as well as the traveling public. And unfortunately, normally when there's an altercation like that, somebody gets hurt, and it's mainly been our officers that are getting hurt.
Ramirez says when migrants seeking asylum rush the ports and technically are on U.S. soil, his officers are legally obligated to process their entry immediately, pushing other asylum seekers to the back of the line. That forces him to rearrange staff. In some cases, that means transporting migrants to receive medical care and remaining with them while they are treated. That takes officers away from ports. Your response to limit the number of vehicle lanes that are open or perhaps move around existing officers resulted in longer wait times, in some cases hours long. How long is that going to last?
Well, again, our intention is to get back to normal operations as quickly as possible. Once we can go back to the set process for people coming into a claim to request asylum, we'll be able to go back to our normal operations. We understand the impact that we have. Matter of fact, there was a study done by U of A years ago that showed that over $7 million a day enters Arizona through our ports of entry. So our primary mission of facilitating travel and trade is still our top priority. However, when you have these incidents happen, you have to realign your resources. You wind up reducing staffing and other processes.
Are you having conversations with, for example, the city of Nogales, who's concerned about what this does to its economic times right now during the holidays?
Absolutely. And we're very fortunate that our stakeholders understand all the responsibilities that we have, not just in the pedestrian and passenger area, but in the commercial merchandise area, plus our enforcement posture. Last year alone, we seized over 10,000 pounds of methamphetamine at the ports of Arizona. Right now, when you're in the middle of a crisis, opioid crisis and other dangerous drugs, it's important that we maintain that enforcement posture.
Many of us have seen the dozens of families, including children, sitting outside the ports waiting. And from the outside looking in, people are asking, why can't you let them in, remove them from the elements, and process their claims? What is your response to that?
Our limitation is basically our facility and how many people we can safely detain at any given time and process at any given time. As you mentioned, sometimes these folks come in and they have an illness and we have to separate them from other people that we have there, so that reduces the number of people we can have in our facility. And our facility was never designed to be a detention facility. Traditionally, the people that we held there were narcotic smugglers or folks using fraudulent documents, so they were primarily adult, single adult, male or female, and when you process them for that type of violation, that process takes 3 to 4 hours and they're in jail. So you weren't holding families for days, you were holding individuals for hours. So now we have a large number of families and individuals that once we process them, we have to hold on to them until ICRO can find space for them. So as those families are taken from us, we can take more families into process. But we are basically at the mercy of other agencies and in this complicated process.
The Department of Homeland Security is facing some scrutiny right now for a program called the Migrant Protection Protocols. Recently here in Nogales, there was a group from Venezuela that were apprehended here but then transferred to El Paso. What exactly is the reason behind that?
The Migrant Protection Protocol program is a government program where individuals that are applying for admission from other countries other than Mexico, but they're coming to the U.S. through Mexico, and they are either entering illegally or with no proper documents, they can be, as part of the process, they can be returned to Mexico to wait for the duration of that process. And that allows us actually to get them before an immigration judge much faster than the traditional process. So people that do qualify for asylum are processed much faster. And the people who do not qualify, it discourages them from coming in knowing that they're just going to be released.
This extends beyond what many people perceive as a human rights crisis. I mean, there's a national security issue as well.
When you look at the amount of narcotics being intercepted at our ports of entry, at a time where we're also going through this crisis, at a time where you have your Christmas shoppers coming, we're in the middle of produce season. So you're talking about over $2 billion worth of produce, over 100 varieties of fruits and vegetables. We're responsible for the movement of that merchandise. In addition to all the other commodities, autos and auto parts, that's another $6 billion worth of merchandise entering. The safety of those products when it comes to our agriculture specialists. And as I mentioned, the interception of thousands of pounds of narcotics at a time when our country, we're losing 60 people a day die as a result of overdoses from these opioids. We have a lot of responsibility. The men and women in blue, the customs officers at our ports of entry, are doing a fantastic job. It's not an easy job, but it's a fantastic job that they're doing.
This week, House Democrats took a step forward toward impeaching President Donald Trump and also paved the way for him to make good on his promise to replace NAFTA. Both issues came up late last month when Representative Raúl Grijalva sat down with Christopher Conover.
Shortly after public impeachment hearings began before Thanksgiving, Congressman Raúl Grijalva told us he believed the House Democratic majority would vote to impeach the president. But he rejected criticism that his party sidelined other pressing issues in favor of the proceedings.
The reality is that we've been doing our job in the House. There's only one branch of government that we control right now, and that's the House of Representatives. That's where the Democrats are in charge. We have sent up to 300 pieces of legislation to the Senate. McConnell hasn't moved on it. Everything from background checks and efforts to reduce gun violence, healthcare issues in terms of drug pricing. We've sent environmental issues. We've sent issues dealing with transportation and how to build an infrastructure and put people to work. We've sent about the security of our voting in 2020. And the list goes on and on. Those are all there. And for the president or any of the Republicans to say we are not doing anything, the abyss is the Senate. Who's in charge of the Senate? The Republicans. So if there is a bottleneck, it is in the Senate because they have not brought any major piece of legislation to the front.
We'll be handing out a memo from the Ways and Means Committee, you may have it, which explains why we are so proud of the distance that we have come from where we started with the administration on this legislation.
The same day Democrats unveiled their articles of impeachment, House Speaker Nancy Pelosi announced a deal on a revised version of the U.S.-Mexico-Canada agreement, a move that both Pelosi and the president praised on Twitter. Leaders of all three nations signed the USMCA more than a year ago.
Republicans say the longer this doesn't pass, jobs in Arizona and other places end up getting hurt. Is that rhetoric, or is there a point where something just has to get passed?
I think at some point it's got to be a yes or no. And quite frankly, it would be good to get it at the beginning of the next session to see what we have in front of us. But, I think that this fixation of this administration on tariffs and other means to try to control not only what's imported and exported, but also as part of foreign policy when it comes to Mexico, I will do tariffs unless you do this in terms of border security. Those issues, I think, have also complicated the situation.
On the issue of border security, Grijalva has consistently spoken out against the Trump administration's policies. This week, the Department of Defense Inspector General opened an investigation into the deployment of National Guard and active duty troops to the border, not long after Grijalva and other Democrats raised concerns about its legality.
And the reason for that is to make sure that we are following the constitutional protection that's there now, which says, quite frankly, that our military cannot enforce civilian laws. Immigration law is a civilian law. In the wheelhouse of Homeland Security and Border Patrol, that's where it belongs. And so we want to make sure that distinction. We want to make sure what they're doing, what training they're getting before they go there. You know, the men and women in uniform, this is not a reflection on them. I predict that many of them are wondering what they're doing in the middle of the Yuma Desert, watching what and doing what in a supplemental role.
Not long after he sat down for this interview, Grijalva traveled to Madrid with a congressional delegation to attend the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change, where they voiced support for the Paris Climate Agreement. Last month, the president began the formal process to withdraw the U.S. from the deal. Grijalva, who chairs the Committee on Natural Resources, has plans to advance the issue in the House.
What I hope to do is to working with the committee members and others to put together a climate change, resilience, sustainability, and that looks at our public lands as sources of a solution and looks at our oceans and coastal areas about resilience and the damage that's being done to our oceans and to our waterways and put those together. And in the area in which we have jurisdiction, to propose in legislation some solutions, some timetables, some steps in which we can turn this jurisdiction we have into something that contributes to the reduction in the warming that's going on in this globe.
As we close out the year, this week we take a deeper dive into some of the headlines that shaped these last few months, plus a look ahead to the new year. I'm joined by Dan Shear, editor of the Green Valley News and Salvarita Sun, and Jim Ninsel of Tucson Local Media. Gentlemen, thanks for being here. All right, I know we want to talk about the impeachment, but there's another thing that's a little bit more Arizona focused. USMCA, we have some movement. I'm going to start with you, Dan. Was the impeachment the holdup?
Well, that's a real good question. I think part of the holdup was that they didn't want the president to have a win, and this is a win, even though the new trade deal doesn't really change much from NAFTA. There are a couple little changes in there for payment for auto workers and then better access to generic drugs, things like that. But I was told in early October when Mike Pence was here that Ann Kirkpatrick and her team, they were on board with it, a couple little things. Here we are 2 months later before it actually gets passed. So I think there was just a little politics involved.
During all the delay, though, did Arizona lose anything as politicians were talking about it and thinking about it, but not acting on it?
You know, uncertainty is never good for business, and I'm sure there were people who wished that it had been nailed down sooner so they could make sure all their relationships were in place and they knew exactly what the numbers were with the plans that they were making. So I imagine there was some losses along the way, but hopefully it will get ratified and people will have that certainty.
It's a very big part of President Trump's campaign, though, so he had to keep going for this, even though ultimately it really doesn't mean much. And you're right, most people won't get into the weeds, they're not going to understand it, but they're going to say he won, he did this for us. Well, you know, one of the outcomes could be that cars are going to cost a little bit more because, again, the wages for certain auto workers have to go up. So that may be one of the things. But it is it's always good when you have the three major countries talking about trade. It's going to make things easier for us. You're probably not going to notice much change.
It's been a few weeks. Tucson has a new mayor, Regina Romero. She's talking about the border wall now. Now she's saying a few things maybe we didn't hear during the campaign.
We've seen the council talk about the border wall even under Jonathan Rothschild. You know, there was definitely opposition, resolutions passed. This is a bad idea. It's a waste of money. We won't do business with people who work on the border wall, I think was one of the things the council did a few years back. So I don't know. I think the interesting thing to watch as Regina settles into office is what's going to happen with the city manager and what's going to happen with the police chief. I hear there's tensions between both those positions within the city and with the mayor, and we have never had much luck in keeping a city manager for very long in the city of Tucson. We seem to turn him over every 2 years. Mike Ortega's been there for 4 or 5 years now. He seems to have brought some real stability there, but whether that will continue, I think, remains to be seen.
Dan, it's not uncommon for a candidate not to say certain things about hot button issues like the border wall. What will this do to the city of Tucson, sort of in the state, if she takes a stance on immigration?
Well, you know, I think the people in Tucson already told us what they think of Sanctuary City, which is they blew it out of the water. They did not want that. Climate change, while it's an important national and international issue, I'm not sure that Tucson, that should really be a priority here. And the border wall, too. I mean, Tucson itself has a lot of issues. Like other cities, they're struggling to draw people to the police force. And there are morale issues there, and there are issues throughout City Hall also. And I think that her attention would be best focused right there, right now. I'm not saying those other issues aren't important. I'm just saying that they shouldn't be a priority.
What are the priorities in the city of Tucson right now? If you mentioned some possible tension with the city manager, the police chief, I mean, what are the issues that are at the forefront?
Well, I think, you know, I think the things that many people in Tucson are worried about, you know, are the basics, you know, the parks, the streets, the police protection, those things. And I think the city, to its credit, has managed to reinvest in a lot of the streets over the last 4, 5, 6 years since they managed to pass some bonds and some sales tax in order to be able to fix the streets, and that is actually moving along. They finally got some bonds passed to fix up the parks, so that is slowly but surely again getting improved. In terms of climate change, I think there's nothing wrong with trying to find better energy efficiency within the city buildings, and maybe making programs available to the private sector to try to increase energy efficiency and things of that nature, because climate change could hit our region very hard. But again, those are kind of the baby steps and the things that you need to do over the long term to try to alleviate your energy issues.
Arizona, can we finally say it's a battleground state as we go into 2020?
Oh, that's a good question. I'm going to throw that to Jim.
I'm going to say it's certainly going to be one of the most watched races when it comes to the Senate race between Mark Kelly and incumbent Martha McSally. That one is going to be a barn burner. It's probably we're going to see all kinds of records broken in terms of spending. Third-party committees are going to roll in here and just bombard us with messages about the two candidates. That one is totally up for grabs, and Kelly's actually ahead in the polling at this point from most polls that we've seen. So, you know, Martha McSally.
This week, though, a new poll shows them in a dead heat.
Yeah. No, it's definitely a super competitive race, I think, and it depends on the polls that you look at. And I think there's no way to say anyone's a favorite at this point. But Martha is the first Republican to lose a campaign for U.S. Senate in this state in 3 decades. When she lost to Kirsten Sinema, she had her backup plan to get appointed, so it worked out okay for her, but she's got a very tough race on her hands. In terms of the presidential race, I think a lot comes down to who the Democrats end up nominating. If it's somebody on the far left, Trump probably walks away with Arizona. If not, it's a competitive state.
Elizabeth Warren has an office in the state of Arizona, and I think maybe a smaller bureau in Tucson.
If she's the nominee, I think I'd go one step further. Trump's going to walk away with the election. He's just going to win, not just in Arizona, but I just think that she is seen as just a little too far left. Biden, though, hurt himself, of course, by suggesting that he might be just in for one term, which means he's a lame duck right away. So there's still so much to be hashed out in for the Democrats, but we'll see what happens. But the key is who they're going to put up.
All right, more closely here at home, though, what's the state legislature going to be focused on this year?
I think they're going to be focused on figuring out how to spend the money that's coming in. The state's doing very well financially, and that always leads to a unique problem, which is that some folks want to spend that money on stuff. Other folks want to give it back to the taxpayers in the form of tax breaks. So there's going to be a fight over how much money's coming in. And there's also, I think, going to be pressure to get out early because it is an election year. And so I think a lot of politicians are going to want to wrap up the session and get on the campaign trail. There are some competitive races out there within the legislative districts, and they don't want to be stuck at the Capitol. Once they're out of the session, they can get on with their fundraising. So I think that's going to be a really key issue. Another one to watch, I think, once again, there's some lawmakers who want to go after the Rio Nuevo district, and we'll see what happens on that front. But I think it's kind of fascinating, given that the Auditor General just came out with a report saying that Rio Nuevo is one of the finest run tax increment financing districts that they have audited in the past. It's really turned itself around, and this effort to knock it down is more ideological than practical.
One other issue, recreational marijuana use. Just this past summer, Attorney General Mark Brnovich said, you know what, I'd rather the legislature handle that than it go to the voters, because if something goes wrong, it'll be a little bit easier to unwind. I don't know that they'll face that this session, but the real interesting thing will be in 2 years after we have redistricting and see where those lines are drawn and see how that affects Southern Arizona.
All right. In the meantime, we'll count on the two of you to keep us up to date. Thanks so much for being here. The University of Arizona is leading a NASA mission to gather a sample from the asteroid Bennu. This week, the mission reached a critical stage, selecting the exact site where scientists hope to collect 2 ounces of the asteroid and bring it back to Earth in 2023. The mission and its many partners have planned, designed, and studied the characteristics of their asteroid for nearly 2 decades. Lockheed Martin in Denver spent more than 10 years designing the instrument that will actually contact Bennu to acquire the material.
We are looking for spots that have 2-centimeter size particles and smaller. And so we're hoping that we're not going to have a whole lot of very large objects, because obviously a very large object is not going to fit inside the TAG-SAM head. We think that the head will be in contact with the asteroid for about 5 seconds. The heart of the mission occurs in 5 seconds out of 14 years.
5 years ago, when that interview was filmed, the mission had a very specific idea of what scientists thought they'd find upon arrival at Bennu last December. After a year of close-up observations and characterizations of the asteroid's physical and chemical properties, they learned this is not the Bennu of all their planning.
When we arrived at Bennu, we really anticipated having a much smoother surface. A lot of the data that we had when we characterized it based on ground-based data really gave us the interpretation that we would have a lot of fine-grained material. There's not a lot of beachfront property on Bennu right now. One of the things that we've had to do in response to seeing that the surface is so rugged, so much more rugged than we anticipated, is we had to sharpen our pencils and change the way that we're going to navigate to the surface a bit. We are using natural feature tracking as our guidance navigation system to the surface.
This will be the first time that NASA is using natural feature tracking to navigate around a small celestial body. The spacecraft will basically use pictures of the surface to generate its own map to the sample sites. To call the surface rugged is an understatement. Some boulders are taller than a 3-story house. That presents safety concerns for the approach to tagging the asteroid for sample collection and the subsequent retreat back to orbit. All these challenges get thorough examinations and science team meetings.
So the spacecraft is able to wave off an approach to tag if the place is going is marked as hazardous, right? So we make a mask of places that you would not want to touch, and the spacecraft is able to say, I'm too close to one of those, I'm going to leave. And so there's what we're calling back-away hazards, which combines several different things. Basically, after we tag, the spacecraft could tip over somewhat, and then it just backs straight away from wherever it's going. And so we're looking at things it could crash into in any of several ways. So
it is not the asteroid that we designed the spacecraft to go and sample. But we expected the unexpected. So we built a lot of capability, a lot of redundancy, and a lot of time at the asteroid. And all of that was put into the mission plan. You have to expect the unexpected when you're going out on an expedition like that.
Some of those capabilities comes from the mission's camera suite called OCAMs, which has been performing flawlessly. The entire surface of Bennu has been photographed and closely analyzed. Those images will be crucial to determining the final sample sites.
This week, actually, on Saturday, we will be acquiring data of those 4 candidate sample sites. And this will be at a higher resolution by about a factor of 3 to 4 from what we have currently. And so having that data is going to allow us to determine between those 4 sites which among them appears to be the best. And so it's a relative assessment. We will be able to see an object the size of a pickle in the candidate sample sites from the Recon A imaging that starts next week.
Each site will be judged on the spacecraft's ability to safely access the surface, the abundance of 2-centimeter or smaller material the spacecraft could scoop up, and science value of the sample, specifically the presence of organics and water-bearing minerals.
The OSIRIS-REx mission has just completed the Recon A phase, which is getting up-close looks at the final 4 sample sites, and the data are phenomenal. We have a lot of information. Each site is unique and challenging and intriguing in its own way, so it's not an obvious decision on which direction we're going to go, but we have the information that we need to make the right choice on both the primary and the backup sample site.
After the 2 final choices are made, several more months of study will reveal objects as small as a penny.
So we're measuring something that's about 10 centimeters across, and we need to know the abundance of 2-centimeter scale rocks. We will be getting that kind of information as we go into Recon B and ultimately Recon C, where we're getting pixel scales of 3 millimeters, which is really unprecedented to characterize an asteroid surface at that scale. As we get into 2020, we're going to be going down to a couple of 100 meters from the surface of the asteroid, so a factor of 5 times closer than we've been in the Recon A sorties. We are looking to announce the sample site at the American Geophysical Union in San Francisco on December 12th.
That announcement of the primary and secondary sample site took place in San Francisco this past Thursday.
So the winner of the OSIRIS-REx Site Selection Championship is the Nightingale site. All right.
Sample collection is scheduled for August 2020. To learn more about the OSIRIS-REx mission, including more images of Bennu, visit asteroidmission.org. That's all for now. Thanks for joining us. To get in touch, visit us on social media or send an email to arizona360@azpm.org and let us know what you think. We'll see you next week.